The day my father died, he left me a house I had never even heard of. And the first thing the lawyer said was that I should sell the house. But I shouldn't spend even one night inside it. He said it as casually as if he were giving me some ordinary advice about an old car. But the way he avoided looking at me made me suspicious. I asked, why would my father leave me a house I had never even known about? He was silent for a moment, then said, because your father bought this house many years ago, but he didn't want anyone to know that it belonged to him. I stared at him and asked, who lived there? The lawyer closed the file in front of him and said, as far as I know, no one. That answer should have reassured me, but it didn't. My father and I had never been very close. After my mother's death, my father grew more distant from me. Eventually, he moved to another state and built a life in which my presence was very small. We only spoke a few times a year, usually on birthdays or holidays, and every conversation ended the same way. Some things are better left in the past. When I was 22, he completely cut himself off. For years, I thought he simply didn't want me to be a part of his life. So when he suddenly died at the age of 64 and left me this property worth $100,000, I assumed maybe this was his way of making up for the things he couldn't give me while he was alive. The house was 3 hours away, at the end of a private road surrounded by dense trees. From the outside, it looked completely abandoned. Dust covered the windows, the paint was peeling, and grass had grown over the driveway. But as soon as I opened the front door, I immediately felt that something was wrong. The house wasn't empty. There was fresh food in the kitchen. A coat was hanging near the stairs, and a glass of water sat on the dining table. Someone had been living there recently. I called the lawyer and asked if he knew about this, but he insisted that the house had been empty for years. I went upstairs and started looking through the rooms. Eventually, I reached the master bedroom. Behind the wardrobe was a small wooden panel. It looked different from the rest of the wall. I pressed it, and it opened. And inside was a narrow, hidden room. There was a desk, several filing cabinets, and dozens of photographs. The first photograph I picked up showed my father standing beside a man I recognized immediately. And that man's name was Richard Vale. He was one of the richest developers in the state, a man whose company had destroyed my father's construction business nearly 20 years earlier. But the shocking part was that the photograph had been taken inside this house, and 6 words were written on the back of the photograph that made my hands go cold. It looks like he died because of me. I spent the entire night going through everything in that hidden room, looking for something that might explain what I was seeing. And with every new document, my father's story became more believable. There were property records, bank statements, photographs, handwritten notes, and newspaper clippings, documenting Richard Vale's rise from a small contractor to one of the most powerful developers in the region. I remembered his name because, when I was a child, my father had mentioned him once. He called Richard a thief, then refused to explain what he meant. Now I understood why. My father's company was among the first companies Richard acquired as he expanded his business. Officially, my father's company went bankrupt after losing a major construction contract, but the documents in the hidden room told a completely different story. The contract wasn't lost because of poor performance. Someone had secretly submitted fake financial documents against my father's company, accusing it of fraud. And those documents appeared to be connected to a consulting company owned by Richard. Then I found something even stranger. My father had been investigating Richard for 18 years. There were photographs of Richard meeting with politicians, lawyers, bankers, contractors, even police officers. There were also copies of private contracts showing that properties were being transferred between companies whose owners were different on paper, but the investigation showed that they were all controlled by the same small group of people. My father wasn't simply collecting rumors, he was building a case. But if he had so much evidence, why had he never exposed Richard? The question came to my mind. The answer was in a letter. My father had written the letter years earlier. In it, he explained that whenever he tried to take action against Richard, someone close to him suffered the consequences. One former employee lost his business. Another suddenly left the state and disappeared. And a third was killed in an incident that police declared an accident. Eventually, my father realized that Richard wasn't just protecting his business. He was protecting something much bigger. Then I found a photograph of my father. She was standing beside Richard. I stared at it for almost a minute. Then I noticed the date written on the photograph. The photograph had been taken 2 months before my mother's death. My mother had always said she had never met Richard Vale. I turned the photograph over. hoping to find another clue. There was a handwritten note from my father. It said, "If you're reading this, you finally discovered why I stayed away from you." I read the next line. "Your mother didn't die in an accident." My breath stopped. 20 years earlier, I had believed my mother died when her car lost control on a rain-soaked highway. My father had been there afterward. He identified her body and attended her funeral. And now I was holding evidence that proved. I called my father's lawyer again, but this time he refused to answer my questions. The last time I spoke to him, I asked, "Did you know about this hidden room?" He was silent for several seconds, then said, "Your father specifically told me never to tell you about it unless you found it yourself." I asked why. He replied, "Because if I told you about it, you would have become a target before you even knew what you were facing." I asked him about my mother. Once again, there was a long silence. Then he said, "Your father believed Richard Vale was responsible for your mother's death." My chest filled with anger. I asked, "Then why did no one tell me?" The lawyer replied, "Because your father didn't have strong enough evidence that would stand up in court." I looked at the evidence spread across the desk in the hidden room, and I realized that my father had spent years searching for exactly this evidence. Then I found another locked drawer. Inside was a small digital recorder. I played it. My father's voice came through. He sounded much older and weaker than I remembered. He said, "If you're hearing this, I'm gone, and you've probably found this house too." He paused for a moment, then continued, "I know what you're going to want to do now. You're going to want revenge. Don't do it." I almost laughed. He had spent years gathering evidence against the man who had destroyed our family, and now he was telling me not to seek revenge. Then he explained why. He said, "Revenge is exactly what Richard expects. If you attack him directly, he'll destroy you. And if you expose him too soon, he'll destroy all the evidence. But if he believes you don't know anything, he'll come looking for you himself." I stopped the recording. For the first time, I understood what my father had been doing. He hadn't just left me a house, he had left me a plan. And the next morning, I called Richard Vale. He answered almost immediately. I introduced myself and told him that my father had left me the house. He was silent for several seconds. Then his voice suddenly became very gentle. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. He said that his relationship with my father had been complicated. I pretended as if I knew nothing about it. I told him that I had found some old documents, but I couldn't understand what they meant. He immediately offered to meet with me, exactly what my father had predicted. Richard wanted to know how much I had discovered, so I agreed to meet him. But before leaving the house, I did something my father had never been able to do. I made copies of every document and sent those copies to 3 different people. If Richard wanted to silence me, he would have to silence 3 other people as well. Richard chose an expensive restaurant in the city, a place where everyone spoke in low voices, and no one looked toward anyone else's table. When he arrived, he looked exactly as I had seen him in the photographs. Perfectly dressed, completely confident, calm, and entirely comfortable among powerful people. He sat across from me and smiled. "I've heard your father left you quite a lot," I replied. "It seems he left me much more than I knew." His smile disappeared for less than a second. I noticed it. Then he asked what I had found. I told him about the house, the documents, and the photographs, but deliberately didn't mention my mother's death. Richard leaned back and said, "Your father spent many years angry with me." I asked why. He said my father blamed him for destroying his company. But according to Richard, the real reason my father's company went bankrupt was my father himself. He claimed that my father had made dangerous financial decisions and refused to admit his mistake. I listened silently. Then he asked, "Did you know your mother?" Richard looked directly into my eyes. Of course. That was the first lie. My mother knew him. But according to my father's documents, Richard had been secretly meeting with her for years. I asked, "What did the 2 of them talk about?" He smiled and said, "Nothing important." That was the second lie. Then I placed a photograph on the table. It showed Richard and my mother standing outside a building. He stared at the photograph. I asked, "What were you 2 doing there?" For the first time, the confidence disappeared from his face. He reached for the photograph, but I pulled it back. Then I said something that froze him in place. My father left me a recording. Richard's expression changed completely. I didn't tell him what was on the recording. I simply stood up and said, "I think my father knew much more about you than you realize." Richard said quietly, "Your father was a sick man." I looked at him and replied, "Maybe, but he was a very informed sick man." Then I walked away. I didn't know it yet, But that meeting had already started the second stage of my father's plan. That night, someone entered the house. They didn't turn on the television, they didn't touch the jewelry, they didn't even touch my wallet. They went straight to the hidden room, and when I arrived the next morning, only one thing was missing: the digital recording. Richard had stepped into the trap. I called the police and reported the theft, but I knew the recording had ended up exactly where my father wanted it to. Before meeting Richard, I had secretly made a copy of the recording and stored it somewhere Richard would never think to look. Richard didn't know that the recording he had stolen wasn't the real evidence. He also didn't know that another secret was hidden inside the house. I found it while examining the floor beneath the desk. One of the wooden boards was loose. I lifted it, and underneath was a metal box. Inside the box were documents that were 20 years old, including an agreement between my mother and Richard. The agreement revealed that my mother had secretly agreed to help my father investigate Richard. She wasn't working with Richard. She was working against him. And then I found the final page. It contained the name of the man who had helped Richard plan my mother's death. He wasn't a stranger. He was my father's closest business partner, the same man who had testified against my father during the bankruptcy proceedings, the same man who had later suddenly disappeared. I searched for his name on the internet and discovered that he was still alive. He had changed his identity and was living under another name. I contacted him. At first, he refused to talk. Then I told him that I had evidence connecting him to my mother's death. He agreed to meet me. When I arrived, he was terrified. He told me that Richard had ordered him to destroy my father's company. But my father had discovered that Richard was moving stolen money through construction projects using fake invoices and inflated property values. My mother discovered it too. She threatened to expose Richard. Richard couldn't control her, so he planned the accident. But Richard didn't know that my father had discovered the truth. Instead of confronting Richard, my father disappeared. He spent the next 20 years gathering evidence. Then the man sitting across from me said something that changed the entire story. He said, "Your father didn't die of natural causes." I stared at him. He told me that my father had been poisoned. The doctors had called it heart disease, but someone had been giving him something that was slowly damaging his heart, and the person who had ordered it had been watching me ever since. When I returned home, I immediately understood why my father had stopped me from taking revenge. Richard wasn't just afraid of the evidence. He was afraid of what would happen if that evidence became public. I contacted the 3 people I had sent copies of my father's files to. They told me everything. Then I contacted a federal investigator whose name appeared in one of my father's documents. I gave him all the evidence, including the financial records, photographs, agreements, and the testimony of my father's former business partner. But I kept one thing hidden. Essentially, I wanted Richard to believe that he had successfully destroyed the most important piece of evidence. 2 days later, Richard called me. His voice was calm. He asked me to meet him at the house. I agreed. When I arrived, he wasn't alone. 2 men were standing behind him. Richard walked into the room and looked around. Then he smiled. "You should have taken my advice and sold this place." I asked why. He said, "Your father spent 20 years destroying himself trying to prove something he could never prove." I looked at him and said, "You killed my mother." His expression changed. Then he said something I would never forget. "Your mother made her own choice." At that moment, I knew he had given me the confession I needed. I had been recording the entire conversation. Richard kept talking because he believed he had already won. He confessed that my father's company had been deliberately destroyed. He confessed that my mother had been threatened. He confessed that my father had been followed. And then he made his biggest mistake. He said, "Your father should have known what happens when you threaten someone like me." I looked into his eyes and asked, "What happens now?" He smiled and said, "Now you disappear too." His 2 men moved toward me. But before they could reach me, the front door burst open. The federal investigators had entered the house. Richard's face turned white. The entire conversation had been recorded. But that wasn't the only thing waiting for him. The 3 people I had sent the evidence to had already handed copies of it over to the investigators. Richard had trapped himself in the very web he had spent years building. Richard's arrest did not happen quietly. Richard tried to claim that I had fabricated all the evidence myself, but the investigators already had years of financial records, testimonies from his former employees, photographs, bank transfers, and his own recorded confession. The man who had controlled everyone around him for 20 years suddenly discovered that when people stop being afraid of you, power means nothing. But the biggest revelation of the investigation was still to come. The authorities discovered that Richard was preparing to leave the country. He had purchased properties overseas, transferred millions of dollars through secret accounts, and even had new identities prepared for several of his closest associates. If I had waited just one more week, he might have disappeared forever. Then the investigators found something else, a file with my name on it. The file had been created when I was 17. Richard had been watching me since my youth. Which schools I attended, where I worked, where I lived, even photographs of my friends were in that file. He wasn't just watching my father, he was waiting for me. Then I finally understood why my father had stayed away from me. He wasn't protecting me from some danger that might appear someday. He was protecting me from a danger that had existed for years. During the trial, Richard's lawyer tried to prove that my father was mentally unstable and obsessed with revenge. But then the investigators presented the hidden room to the court. They presented the photographs, financial records, recordings, and original documents my father had collected over the years. Then they presented evidence that Richard himself had entered the house after meeting me and stolen the recording. The final piece of evidence came from the security cameras on the private road. They showed Richard's vehicle heading toward the house at exactly the time the burglary occurred. After that, Richard's lawyer also stopped defending him. Eventually, Richard faced charges related to financial crimes, conspiracy, intimidation, and crimes connected to the investigation into my mother's death. But there was one thing I never expected. My father had left another letter. It wasn't hidden in the house. I received it after the trial ended. And in that letter, my father apologized to me. Not for disappearing, not for being angry, but for something else. He wrote that he had spent so much time planning his revenge that he had almost forgotten that revenge was never supposed to become your life. Then he told me what he wanted me to do with the house. My father wanted me to keep the house, not as a reminder of Richard, not as a memorial to my mother's death either. He wanted me to turn it into something completely different. So that's exactly what I did. I sold most of the property and used the money to establish a foundation for families who had lost their businesses because of financial fraud and corporate intimidation. I kept the house because I wanted there to be a place where the entire truth could always be preserved. The hidden room was turned into an archive. The photographs remained on the walls. All the documents were authenticated and preserved. And on this desk, where my father had sat for years planning everything, I placed a photograph of my mother. Not the photograph with Richard, the photograph of her smiling outside our childhood home. That's how I wanted to remember her. Months later, I went to my father's grave. I stayed there silently for a long time. Then finally I said, "You were right. Revenge didn't bring my mother back. It didn't bring back my childhood. It didn't even erase the years I spent believing that my father didn't love me. But the truth did what revenge could never do. It stopped Richard from destroying another person's life." When I turned to leave, I noticed something inside the envelope containing my father's final letter that I hadn't seen before. A small photograph. It showed my father and my mother standing together outside this house. Written on the back were the words, "This was the thing worth protecting." I stared at the photograph for a long time. Then I understood. This entire plan had never really been about Richard. Richard was the enemy, but he wasn't the real reason my father had spent 20 years hiding the truth. The real reason was me. My father knew that if he confronted Richard directly, I would eventually become part of the war too. So he waited. He gathered every piece of evidence. He built a trap that could remain in place even after he was gone. And when he left this world, he gave me the one thing Richard never expected, a choice. I could leave everything behind and move on, or I could finish what my father had started. I chose the second path. Not because I wanted revenge, but because after 20 years of lies, I wanted the last thing Richard had to face in his life to be the truth. And that was what Richard never understood. He believed powerful people win because they control everyone around them. He was wrong. Sometimes, the person you spend years trying to silence is the very person who eventually tells the whole world what you did. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't destroying your enemy yourself. The best revenge is leaving behind a trap so carefully built that when your enemy finally steps into it, he destroys himself.